Hello, everyone. This is Jeff Halper speaking to you from Jerusalem for my August update. Now, August is a quiet month, the quietest month of the year. Everybody's on vacation, nobody's answering their phones. But there's a disconnect between our lives and what's happening politically um, in Palestine. And in fact, this is maybe one of my most urgent updates because right at this moment, we're at the culmination, the violent culmination of 130 years of Zionist colonization of Palestine. These are exactly the months right now, um, certainly beginning in its most intensified stage of completing the colonization of Palestine after October 7th in the Gaza genocide. But that has long moved to the West Bank, which is much more important for Israel than Gaza is. This is where Israel wants to expand. This is the heart of Judea and Samaria, where the settlements are being built. And Gaza is really marginal from the settler colonial Zionist point of view. The West Bank is really the focus. And this is exactly the time. Um, um, as Gaza has been moved, the Gazification of the West Bank, as the Israeli Ministry of Defense calls it, the Gazification process has begun in the West Bank. And uh, uh, and so, you know, I'm going to get into how this is really being done, the mechanisms. That's important to understand. But what's driving me in this update is the violence, the brutality, the humiliation, the degree of displacement, the terror that the Palestinians are going through. The violence that's coming into their homes every day as every Palestinian community is being invaded, certainly in Area C, but also more and more in areas B and A that were supposed to be outside of Israeli control, direct military control. And families are being terrorized. I'm saying this, I guess my sense of anger and of alarm really in this update is both political and also human. Politically, from the point of view that these are the days that Israel is finishing its settler colonial project and making it permanent and creating permanent facts on the ground. But this is also the time in which, I mean, Palestinians have experienced, unimaginable violence, and from the Nakba to Sabra and Shatila, to all kinds of episodes in the West Bank and so on. Black September, not always confined to Palestine, but Gaza, the Gaza genocide, probably at the height. But in some ways, the Gazification of the West Bank has all the genocidal aspects of what happened in Gaza. Certainly on a cultural, on a human level, in terms of the violence, um, and politically in terms of its significance, because again, the West Bank is much more significant than Gaza in the Zionist colonial project. So this is kind of a sense of urgency that I'm speaking from. And the urgency comes again from a very dry, gray academic term that we seldom use, but I talk about all the time, which is normalization. Normalization is the way settler colonialism wins. Uh, Palestine simply becomes Israel. The Palestinian presence is removed. A lot of the Palestinian physical presence, not only cultural presence, is removed from the country, and the country is transformed from an Arab Palestinian country into a Jewish Israel. And normalization is at the door. I don't think we're grasping, all of us, the urgency of the moment. Um, Already many Arab states have joined the Abraham Accords. Kazakhstan is the latest Muslim state. Um, and, Saudi Arabia is at the door as well. I mean, it's giving lip service, of course, to the fact that there has to be a pathway, as it calls it, to a Palestinian state. But this huge deal of the last week of Saudi Arabia will get the ability to enrich nuclear materials, to have a nuclear industry, if it joins the Abraham Accords, really shows the importance of normalization in terms of the political processes going on today. Syria, just this week, announced that it is entering into a security agreement with Israel. So normalization does not mean necessarily a formal joining of the Abraham Accords. It could be that Saudi Arabia won't physically join, won't actually join. Syria will probably not actually join. Lebanon, which is now in peace talks with Israel, it might not actually join the Abraham Accords for domestic reasons, but that doesn't matter. It's de facto joining. It's the de facto normalization with Israel. And so what's now normalization is a unilateral process. It has nothing to do with the Palestinians whatsoever. Normalization is a state issue. It's between the United States, the Arab countries, and Israel. It's not a negotiations. It's an imposed settlement, if you want to call it that, that leaves the Palestinians out completely. And therefore, everything that Israel can grab, all the land it can grab, until the time that this normalization process is actually kind of completed, becomes permanent. It's not there's no going back. Israel is not going to negotiate with the Palestinians a two-state solution, or going back to the 67 lines, or removing any settlements. Whatever Israel can do, grab land, build settlements, displace Palestinians, until that moment when basically this has been normalized, Israel keeps and the Palestinians lose. It's a unilateral direction. And this is Israel's window. This is why it's so intense. The violence and the settlement and the displacement of the Palestinians is so intense at this moment, because this is Israel's window for finalizing, after 130 years, its a colonial project. And there's two timelines in a way. The major one is Trump's administration. Because Trump, even though Trump might not like Netanyahu and he's getting closer to the Arab states, all that stuff, nevertheless, Trump has given Israel absolute cover to complete its settler colonial project. His administration has already recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital. The American embassy is here. It's given absolute a green light for settlements to expand as much as they want. As a matter of fact, in Trump's plan that was presented in 2020, all of Area C, the 62% of the West Bank where the settlements are a part of Israel. So that's already a part of the plan. And pacification until genocide can proceed. We saw that even under Biden, but certainly under Trump as well. And now again, that Gazification process is moving to the West Bank. So Israel has this cover to do anything it wants to do, as outrageous as it is, with as much criticism as it's facing. It is not facing sanctions, which is important. And that's because the Americans primarily protect Israel. But we have to say, in Europe, Germany, and Italy certainly are the two countries that also give that diplomatic cover to Israel. And we also have to say Russia and China. India, many of the BRICS countries are also giving that kind of diplomatic cover to Israel. So it has, but Trump is the main actor, of course, in terms of protecting Israel. The United States always has been. And therefore, in a way, the timeline is the end of the Trump administration. Who knows what's going to happen after that? But there might be even a shorter timeline, and that's the end of the Netanyahu administration. Elections are coming on October 27th. There is not going to be a great change in policy. Whatever government takes over from Netanyahu, whether it's Eisenkot or the opposition so-called, it's going to be as right-wing a government as Netanyahu's. It's simply another Likud government that's coming in, but without Netanyahu. But it also won't have Smotrich, Ben-Gvir. It won't have, it won't have the overt And this is the fear, of course, of the Netanyahu government. It'll try to kind of improve Israel's international status. It'll maybe relax in terms of the military, certainly the military campaigns. It won't make the settlements so obvious. It won't be supporting the violence of the settlers as much as this government does. So even though the policies might change, there's a real concern among the settlers, Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben Gvir, that if we don't, everything we have to do, we really have to do not only by the end of Trump's administration, but really in a way by the end of the Netanyahu government, which let's say the new government comes in sometime in November, December. So it's a very short timeline. This is why what I'm talking about is so urgent. Because again, whatever facts on the ground, it can impose, it can create until whatever timeline of normalization emerges becomes permanent. Uh, and therefore, and therefore, the urgency is not only political from that point of view, but it's certainly political because it's certainly important to us because the Palestinians are left out of this process completely, as we mentioned. And not only that, but I think normalization, and I've said this before, represents the greatest threat to the Palestinians since the Nakba, because it isn't only a political defeat, or let's say, making permanent and normal the Zionist settler colonial reality of Judaizing Palestine, but the price is the elimination of the Palestinians completely. The elimination of the Palestinians in some way as a people in Palestine, whether that means genocide like in Gaza, whether it means mass transfer or displacement or expulsion, as is still the American-Israeli policy towards Gaza. This hasn't ended, this idea of taking up to 2 million Palestinians and relocating them somewhere else, South Sudan, Libya, wherever. There are still negotiations. This is still a real intention. It might not happen, but it shows the intention of eliminating the Palestinians as a people. And of course, the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, driving farmers off their lands, actually now beginning to move into areas A and B, threatening Palestinian towns and cities. So really physically eliminating, whether it's through killing or through expulsion or through marginalization into little tiny enclaves, the Palestinians as a people here in Palestine. It also means eliminating them as a people, obviously inhabiting a significant part of the land, because the basis of settler colonialism is taking the land. You can't take over a country. You can't Judaize Palestine without taking over the land. So the Palestinians will also be displaced from more than 90% of Palestine. It means eliminating the Palestinians as a population that's capable of resisting Israeli colonization. So pacification, this violent repression that we're witnessing today, in military terms, pacification, the breaking of all Palestinian resistance, is a precondition for normalization. You can't normalize as long as there's resistance. And so that's the military pressure, and also eliminating the Palestinians as a cultural, historical presence in Palestine. Judaization means making this country Jewish and erasing any Palestinian presence. This is cultural genocide. There's a physical part of genocide, which is the killing of people. And there's a cultural part, which is erasing their cultures and making it impossible for them to reproduce their cultures in their countries, which is, the price of that the Palestinians are going to have to pay, because genocide is built into settler colonialism. And genocide is a very academic term, of course, but it really means murder. Let's say this clearly. Genocide is murder. It's the physical and cultural murder of a people. And it's built into settler colonialism. And the term that this murder takes form in Zionism is Judaization. That's why this term is so important. Judaization is not simply a process of making the country Jewish. It requires genocide. It's a violent, brutal, dehumanizing process. And it's a term we seldom use. But at any rate, genocide is required. So we're at the height, even after the genocide in Gaza, we're at the height of a larger campaign, at least since the Arab Revolt of 1936, of genocide, systematic genocide, displacement, removal of the Palestinians' physical and cultural presence from this country. Now, Israel is smart. It's very hard to sell murder internationally. And of course, Israel realizes that its ability to do this, to murder the Palestinian people and to take over its country and to Judaize it, all depends on hasbara, on its ability to present itself as a liberal, peace-loving country, a European, subtext white democracy, fighting for its existence and security, because security becomes the issue. As Kamala Harris and Biden said, Israel has a right to defend itself. So this framing is crucial for Israel's ability to continue its genocidal policies. It's fighting for its own security against implacable Arab Islamic forces that are also dehumanized. They've been called human animals by Gallant, the Minister of Defense, when the attack on Gaza began. They've been called cockroaches by the Chief of Staff Eitan during the Lebanon War in 1982. All these animal terms that colonists always apply to the dehumanized peoples that they're colonizing in order to take away any sense of guilt they might feel in terms of actually killing real people. So you make the real people into animals or intractable or savage or barbaric. Or, we all know these terms. Ehud Barak, who was a Labor prime minister, this isn't just Likud, this is built into Zionism, called Israel a villa in the jungle, right? All this is crucial for maintaining international support for Israel. And therefore, what we have to really look at as well and be aware of and fight against is the fact that its genocidal intentions and Israel's genocidal actions are hidden effectively behind a facade of dry, gray, invisible, technical laws and regulations and policies, administration, right? That I've called the matrix of control. And it really is, in a sense, the banality of evil. It's concealing the evil that is the violence that Israel is doing under the banality of proper administration, right? And we're simply running the country like any other country would be run, and therefore concealing the genocide. And this is also what would allow it to normalize its rule. Let me just take a couple minutes to go over these mechanisms because they're super important for us to understand. I've written quite a bit about them. I wrote about them in one of my books, in Israeli and Palestine. If you look up, I've written quite a bit about the matrix of control, so you have that kind of a detail as well. Also, I should recommend Eyal Weizman's book, The Holy Land, The Hollow Land. That's excellent. That really gets into these mechanisms of control and normalization as well. And you can see it through the Nakba. The power of normalization is really strong. You can see it in the Nakba. Here you had, in 1947-48, the military conquest of Palestine, of what became Israel, of 78% of Palestine, the mass expulsion of Palestinians, about 750,000 people were physically expelled from the country, the destruction of up to 600 Palestinian villages and towns and urban areas as well, massive destruction and displacement under a violent military conquest. And then that replaced in 1948 with a military government over the Palestinian citizens of Israel that lasted until 1966, when it was in 67 simply transferred into the West Bank. More than 90% of the Palestinians' land was expropriated in what became Israel. And yet, and here's the power of normalization, it's seen today as normal. When we talk about a peace agreement, a two-state solution, look at Oslo. We're not talking about Israel. Israel, the 78% of Palestine that was conquered and ethnically cleansed and Judaized in a sense, has been accepted as a Jewish state. There's no government that would talk about dismantling Israel as a Jewish state. That's why the settler colonial approach is so resisted, because it means bringing Israel into the equation, because all of Palestine is colonized. And even the Palestinians have kind of internalized this reality. When Oslo began, the PLO could have said, okay, two states, we don't like it, but we'll accept it for realpolitik reasons. But let's begin negotiations with the 1947 partition plan that gives unjustly 56% of Palestine to the Jews for a Jewish state, but it also gave 42% of Palestine to the Palestinians for so now, if we start with at least with the 47 partition plan, now we're starting negotiations where the Palestinians are getting more than 40% of the country, which is certainly better than the 22%. That was, since all these years has been the basis of negotiations. The idea of the two states is that Israel remains on the 78%, half of which was conquered in 47, 48, and the Palestinians simply accept a state or whatever on the other 22%. And that was accepted by the PLO as the starting point of the Oslo negotiations until today. So it just shows the fact that everything Israel did in the Nakba, the brutal colonization of the Nakba that led to an expanded state of Israel, way beyond what had been agreed upon in the partition plan by the UN, has been accepted. It's been normalized, even by many Palestinians, and certainly the Palestinian authorities and so on. So this is the power of normalization that we have to keep in mind. Now, that moved in 1967 to the West Bank and Gaza. And again, I'm going to emphasize the West Bank, what's happening today, because the West Bank is more important, as I said, for Israel than Gaza. Gaza is marginal. Israel is happy to give it over to Jared Kushner for his corporate colonization of Gaza. Just get rid of Gaza. Israel will retain military control, but it does not want to annex Gaza. I mean, there's some crazy settlers that want to settle Gaza, but the vast majority of Israelis don't even agree with that. They would simply like to see Gaza disappear, as Rabin once said. So the focus of, even though we can't keep the genocide in Gaza out of the equation, we still have to focus on that because it's ongoing. It hasn't ended. Nevertheless, the focus of our attention politically should be on what's happening in the West Bank, because this is where Israel is expanding into, and this is where the settler colonial project is focused. So in terms of the mechanisms, just to mention them, because again, many of them are invisible because they're hidden under the civil administration. And people don't even know what the civil administration is, many people, although it's crucial to normalizing and covering the crimes that Israel is committing in the occupied territories. The civil administration was created in 1981. It's run by the Ministry of Defense to run the occupied territories. It's the military government over the occupied territories, mainly over the West Bank today, because there's, neither Israel nor the PA, the Palestinian Authority, are really present, haven't been present in terms of governing Gaza, because Israel was cooperating with Hamas in terms of governing Gaza. So the civil administration is focused mainly in the West Bank, and it's called a civil administration. You see how language is used? Not the military government, which it is, but a civil administration. So now we're creating a normal, proper civil administration of planning for land and giving building permits and infrastructure and all these kind of technical things that are really very political and very brutal. And what we have to understand is that Bezalel Smotrich is the governor of the West Bank. People don't all know this, including our people, but Smotrich is the deputy defense minister responsible for the civil administration, which gives him all that power, the military power and the administrative power of a civil administration over the West Bank. He is the governor of the West Bank, this violent settler called Bezalel Smotrich. And the West Bank is run through the civil administration by over 3,000 military orders, because in international law, an occupying power that Israel denies it's an occupying, it denies it as an occupation. Nonetheless, under international law, the 14th Convention, an occupying power is forbidden to extend its law into an occupied territory. And so the way Israel's gotten around that is by imposing more than 3,000 military orders over every aspect of Palestinian life in the occupied territories. Only since October, October 7th, another 114 military orders have been issued about confiscating land and expanding the settlements. In other words, this is all what gives that legal patina, that legal cover to to Israel's political program of colonization of the West Bank. And it also then allows Israel internationally to avoid sanctions, in its violations, brutal violations of international law. So the civil administration. Now, the civil administration, for example, just this year, then launched what they called the Land Registration Initiative. I mean, what could be more boring and banal and of little interest to people than something? You see, that's exactly the point. By hiding what it's doing under these dry, boring, technical kinds of concepts, Israel succeeds in disappearing what it's doing. I mean, once it goes over the radar, sometimes in an especially brutal raid or action or whatever, people pay attention, like the settler violence going on today. But 98% of what Israel is doing to make its colonization of Palestine permanent and systematic is done under these kinds of mechanisms, legal, administrative mechanisms that we don't know and we don't see. And there's no reaction to them because they're basically invisible. So, for example, in February, the civil administration, Smotrich, launched the Land Registration Initiative in Area C. That means that if Palestinians cannot produce rigorous Ottoman or Jordan area legal documentation that the land really belongs to them, and obviously you didn't have a lot of that documentation in the Ottoman and Jordanian times up until 67, the land automatically becomes registered as Israeli state property. And of course, the civil administration has a whole brigade of lawyers. So even if a Palestinian does produce a deed, it really doesn't mean very much. So basically, it's opening the way to expropriating almost the rest of the West Bank, because Israel already controls 58% of Area C, which is about 14% of the West Bank altogether. So the vast majority of Area C is 62% of the West Bank. Israel controls 58% of that, right? And now, of course, with the land registration process, Israel will be able to sort of take over most of the rest of Area C, and now it's beginning to move in to areas A and B because Smotrich is urging the Israeli government to do what de facto has already been done, and that is to declare the Oslo Accords null and void, which means that there is no more A and B, and now Israel can take over the entire West Bank. And that means, of course, settler expansion. This is the way it's done. And again, it's done in a dry, gray, technical sort of a way. The Israeli government just this a couple months ago approved $2.3 billion to expand settlements across the West Bank. There's going to be tens of thousands of new housing units, new settlements. There's 185 new outposts that have been established on hilltops throughout the West Bank. And this is where the settlers are coming down and raiding Palestinian towns, and especially farming villages, shepherding villages, and driving the people off the land. And in addition to that, there's 102 new settlements, not just little outposts of a few violent settlers, but actual new legal settlements that have been created in addition to about 200 that already exist. And all this is being legalized, the outposts, the new settlements, and so on, so that there are tens of thousands of new housing units being built, not to mention, of course, infrastructure, the highways that are being built that incorporate irreversibly the West Bank into Israel. Together with that, there's economic strangulation of the West Bank. I mean, really, we're not aware of this, but the West Bank is approaching, in economic terms, in the terms of human suffering, it's beginning to approach the famine, the hunger, the medical emergencies in Gaza. You know, let's not forget, until October 7th, used to come into Israel to work. Israel destroyed a lot of the Palestinian economy. It turned the Palestinian workforce into a casual workforce dependent on Israel. 170,000 Palestinians would come daily into Israel, do whatever work that was being done, more casual labor, low-paid casual labor, and then they'd go home. Well, Israel discovered, first of all, even back in the 90s with Oslo, that it's cheaper to employ foreign workers from India, from Sri Lanka, Romania, Thailand, China, even West Africa, than it is to employ Palestinians. And they can be thrown out, the foreign workers. The Palestinians kind of stay. And so for a long time, there's been a process of locking Palestinians out of the Israeli economy that culminated in October 7th. So since October 7th, this is almost 3 years ago, almost the entire Palestinian workforce has been locked down and prohibited from coming into Israel to work. So people have not had income for almost 3 years. Not to mention that, but Israel has withheld the taxes that it owes to the Palestinian Authority. Hundreds of millions of dollars that should be going to the Palestinian Authority for medical services, social services, for schools and teachers and so on, haven't been paid because Israel's withholding those taxes. And who's the Minister of Finance in the Israeli government? Bezalel Smotrich. Not only the governor of the West Bank, but also the person who's able to choke the Palestinian economy. And of course, we all know the very severe banking restrictions that Palestinians are under. Go try to transfer funds to a Palestinian that needs help, even on a personal level, and you'll find that your bank will probably not transfer any funds to a Palestinian bank. There's no way to get even financial assistance to Palestinians. So all this is happening, and economic strangulation. And then, of course, all the restrictions on movement to make life in Palestine impossible. This is part of the pacification. Part of pacification is despair. Jabotinsky, one of the founders of the Zionist movement and the founder of the Likud party, basically, of Netanyahu and Begin, he wrote in 1923 that the way Zionism wins is through despair. Only when Palestinians despair of Israel, of Palestine not becoming Jewish, only when they despair of ever having a Palestinian state of their own will they finally submit. So despair humiliation, um, terrorizing people in their homes. And this is really what drove me to talk about this today. Um, uh, Watching your children, getting arrested. There are thousands of Palestinian kids in jail. 24,000 Palestinians have been arrested in the West Bank since October 7th. Many of them, you also have in Israel administrative detention. The British emergency regulations from 1945 are still in effect, so you can arrest thousands of people and hold them. There are 20,000, another 20,000, besides the 24,000 arrested in the West Bank, there's another 10,000 that are still being detained from Gaza. Some fighters, whoever Israel picked up, right, that are languishing in Israeli prisons in torture-like conditions. Israel does not allow the Red Cross to visit its prisons that are being held indefinitely. There's no trials. There's no prospect of trials. They've never been charged with anything, simply being held. So you've got something like 35 to 40,000 Palestinians being held in Israeli prisons, or that have been held in Israeli prisons, including a considerable number of children, under the age of 18. So that, and at least 1,200 Palestinians have been killed by soldiers and settlers in the West Bank, normal Palestinians, not in any kind of fighting, but Palestinian civilians in the West Bank since October 7th. So, and you've got you also have part of the Gazification pacification process is also the military invasion of the West Bank, especially the refugee camps in the north, Jenin, Tulkarm, Nablus, Balata, but also expanding now to other camps under what's called Operation Iron Wall. The point I'm trying to make is the urgency of the moment, both in terms of the scale of human suffering that this pacification process has brought down upon the Palestinians today, and also in terms of the impending normalization, in which that's coming down the pipeline soon, of which the Palestinians are not a factor whatsoever. So this creates an urgency, both a human and political urgency, that we have to respond to more effectively. We're at the culmination, as I said, of Zionist settler colonialism, both physically in terms of the Judaization of Palestine and the de-Arabization, the erasing of the Palestinian presence here, and also politically in terms of normalization. So it's urgent, again, that we respond, especially all of you abroad in the international grassroots support networks, respond effectively to what's actually happening in Palestine. Now, I understand that a lot of your campaigning does have to do with local issues. You're lobbying your parliaments or Congress. You're engaged with all the local discussions. There's all kinds of local dynamics around Palestine that you have to deal with in whatever country you're in. That's for sure true. But at the same time, there's a disconnect between international campaigning that kind of tends to have a life of its own and what's actually happening in Palestine. In other words, what I'm feeling here, sitting in Palestine, is that there is not the international immediate support, and there's also not the campaigning around the issues that we've talked about today that are actually coming down the pipeline, that are actually affecting in decisive, determining ways the political situation here. And that disconnect is a problem. Think about all the campaigns that your organization or that are going on in your country. Think of the different, and all the campaigns are great and they're all important, and this is not criticism. But now let's look at, if I'm sitting here in Palestine, what I can try to suggest, let's look at what campaigns should be going on if, in fact, the campaigning abroad was Palestine-centered, was more tightened and more connected to what's actually happening to Palestinians in Palestine. What would that look like? So if there was a Palestinian-based campaigning going on abroad, in other words, a campaigning abroad, all of which is important, but if there was a prioritizing of campaigning in terms of what's happening here in Palestine, both on the human level and on the political level, what would a prioritized set of campaigns look like that are tied to what's happening here? And let's compare them to, or you compare them. I'm not going to do that because there's a million campaigns. Compare them to the campaigns that are actually being run in your country or by your organization, and let's see what's missing. First of all, the first set of campaigns obviously should be to stop the genocide, which is ongoing both in Gaza and the West Bank, and to stop the settlement process. So the first campaign that I would suggest, one of the most immediate ones, would be a campaign for a UN protection force in the West Bank. This has been brought up here and there, but as far as I know, there is no organized campaign, to have a protection force in the West Bank to actually protect the Palestinians from the brutalization that they're going through today. Second, there should be a campaign to monitor the reconstruction of Gaza, so-called reconstruction. I mean, what Trump managed to do with international approval somehow, and with Israel, of course, is to take the reconstruction process out of the hands of the UN, where it belonged, and all the professional humanitarian and reconstruction agencies that the UN has, the international agencies, and give it to Jared Kushner and Witkoff and Israel. I mean, Israel until today determines who can go in and out of Gaza. Israel until today forbids journalists from going in. So Israel still has control of Gaza. It's expanded from its yellow line of 53% to more than 70% of Gaza. It's still killing Palestinians on a daily basis. The genocidal condition still exists. So a campaign not only to monitor really the reconstruction of Gaza, but to take the reconstruction out of the hands of this Trump Board of Peace that has even said this week that it is not going to reconstruct all of Gaza in the foreseeable future, but it's going to start with a little tiny pilot project over a few blocks in a part of Rafah that could maybe over the next winter, maybe house 10,000 or so Palestinians. So basically, there is no reconstruction plan, and we have to take this whole process out of the hands of Trump and his cronies back into the hands of the UN and bring the Palestinians, especially local Gazans, back into the process. This is really crucial in terms of Gaza. Another campaign, and this is being done by different groups, to obviously end the arms trade with Israel. That's important. Another campaign that's immediate, that is not being done as far as I know, is a campaign for enforcing the Fourth Geneva Convention. I mean, we talk a lot about human rights, and human rights are limited. It's very hard to enforce international law, but nevertheless, that body exists. And it's true, you have the ICJ, you have the ICC, you have conventions against apartheid, you have conventions against genocide. But the most effective, if we're going to take this whole area of human rights and international law, everything is embodied in the Fourth Geneva Convention. This is the convention that sets out exactly the rights and the protections that an occupied population like the Palestinians must enjoy. The assumption being that an occupied population is vulnerable, it has no way of protecting itself, and the Fourth Geneva Convention is that, and it also prohibits and obligates the occupying power, which is Israel, from doing harm to the Palestinians. Everything Israel does is in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, from house demolitions to settlement building to infrastructure building to the destruction of the economy to restrictions on freedom of movement. I can go on and on and on. And Israel, in fact, under the Fourth Geneva Convention, international law, is obliged to ensure the well-being of the Palestinian population under its control. So if we want one focused target that really brings all the obligations and duties and constraints of an occupying power on an occupied population into account, a campaign to enforce the Fourth Geneva Convention would be really the most strategic, because it has built within it a tribunal. The high contracting parties to the convention can call a tribunal that would convene in Geneva, and then to decide whether or not Israel is in gross violation of the articles of the convention, which it is, and then sanctions. Now we're back to the same problem that sanctions go through the Security Council and you have the veto power of the United States. But nevertheless, if we want a really focused, serious campaign to bring international law into the picture in terms of constraining Israel, at least, a campaign to enforce the Fourth Geneva Convention is really important. Now, another category of campaigns should be stop normalization, and certainly keep the Palestinians at the center of attention, because, as we talked about, in the normalization process, the Palestinians are excluded. There's no negotiations. They're not a part of deciding the relations between a greater Israel and Israel with its settlements and normal diplomatic relations with the Arab states and with the international community. So we have to keep the Palestinians at the center. Don't let them get lost in the shuffle. And at the same time, stop the normalization process. This is the most urgent, I think, of all, almost, maybe except dealing with Gaza and the West Bank in a human sense. And therefore, what's really called for is a campaign against normalizing Israeli apartheid. Now, normalization isn't even a term we use very much. I mean, I go to rallies in different parts of the world. It's great that there are rallies. Sometimes hundreds of thousands of people come out. I never hear the word normalization. I certainly never hear the word judaization. So the whole kind of analysis is missing, and I think the urgency is missing. I think the focus tends to be missing to some degree in our campaigning. So normalization should be at the forefront of our campaigning, and there should be an international campaign against normalizing Israeli apartheid that deals with the Abraham Accords and everything coming down again, this famous pipeline. There should also be a monitoring of the process, because as normalization is moving ahead, Saudi Arabia says, well, there has to be a pathway to a Palestinian state. Everybody's talking about a two-state solution. It's obvious to all of us that we're talking about two-state apartheid. And so as the normalization process goes on, even as we're trying to fight it, we should also be monitoring it to be sure that they're not selling two-state apartheid under the cover, in the guise of an actual two-state solution that somehow, gives Palestinians their rights of self-determination that we know it doesn't do. So we have to monitor the peace process, and again, monitor it in a way that keeps the Palestinians at the center. Third, there should be campaigns to make Zionism unsustainable. This was the strategy of the ANC. To make this, they couldn't beat the South African government militarily. They couldn't overthrow the government. The government was actually very strong in many ways, as governments are. It had international support to some degree. It weakened over time, but certainly in the early years, the South African government had the support of the United States and the UK and other powerful countries. And therefore, there was a campaign to make South African apartheid unsustainable. But the key to it was, and this is the difference between the BDS of the ANC and the BDS of today, of the Palestinians, in my view, is that the ANC had a clear political end game. We all knew what we were BDSing for, and that was one person, one vote. So when de Klerk came to Mandela with all kinds of suggestions, power sharing, 2 or 3 parliament houses for whites and coloreds and blacks and Asians or whoever, all kinds of, Mandela would say, no, one person, one vote, and I'm sitting in jail until that becomes, that's the political outcome. And that's what we all supported. We knew what we were BDSing for, and the political campaigning was then very clear. So this is something the BDS movement is very developed in Palestine. It's strategic, but it's lacking a political endgame that I've said for a long time. And if we're going to make Zionism unsustainable, you're not going to make it unsustainable simply economically. You can hurt Israel economically in certain ways, but to make the system collapse, there has to be a focused BDS campaign um, uh, that highlights the political endgame of one person, one vote. So it becomes a political instrument. It isn't a standalone boycott Israel thing of its own. And to make Zionism unsustainable, of course, there should also be campaigns to suspend Israel from the UN. I know this has been suggested. There might be the beginnings of some campaigns like that. I'm not aware of a really developed campaign like that, but maybe there is. And if it is, then it certainly should be brought out much more broadly. Nevertheless, suspend Israel from the UN and from other international bodies, which is really important. And those things together with the political endgame would really put us on the path to making Israel unsustainable as a Zionist regime. Now, for all of this, and these are these are the campaigns that I would suggest that arise from what I call a Palestinian-based political analysis and prioritizing of campaigning. So compare what the campaigns are today that you're involved with with this list of the prioritized campaigns that I'm proposing, and see, where things could be tightened and where things could be made more organized and coordinated and strategic. And in all of this, of course, we have to have Palestinian leadership and coordination. That's very important. And I think it's very difficult because here, like I've said, all this the level of suppression of Palestinians is really hard to convey, but not only by Israel but by the PA itself. The Palestinian leaders exist, the political programs exist, the possibility of organizing exists, but the suppression is tremendous. And that's why the international community has to come in and give Palestinians a kind of protected space where they can begin for here to take the leadership role that they're very capable of taking. And here I would suggest certainly the PYN in the United States, in the UK, and in other countries, together with other Palestinian organizations abroad, should really, be leading this campaign of empowering the Palestinians here in Palestine to take the leadership role that they have to take. So these are my suggestions for what I call a Palestinian-based set of campaigns that are prioritized in terms of what's actually happening today in Palestine. I hope this is useful, both the big analysis and the more practical suggestions for campaigning. Sorry if it's so long, but there's a lot to say. Again, the urgency of the moment, and I'll see you all in September. Bye.